war is the improvement of investment climates by other means, Clausewitz for dummies.
The Scott Horton Show.
Taking out Saddam Hussein turned out to be a pretty good deal.
They hate our freedoms.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited.
We couldn't wait for that Cold War to be over, could we? So we can go and play with our toys in the sand. Go and play with our toys in the sand.
No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare.
Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin military action in Libya. That action has now begun.
When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
I cannot be silent in the face of the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
All right, you guys, introducing the great Trita Parsi. He is the founder of the National Iranian American Council. He is a professor at Georgetown University, and he's the author of a few books. The latest is Losing an Enemy, about the Iran nuclear deal. So much for that. But you got to read Treacherous Alliance. Man, oh man, that book, Treacherous Alliance, I'll tell you what. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing, Trita?
Thank you so much for having me.
Happy to have you here. So, big doings. I keep telling everyone, I'm not that alarmed. I'm just not feeling it. I just don't think there are enough factions who support an attack on Iran right now, compared to 2002 and 2003, and there's just nothing to fight about except for the fact that America's picking this fight. We're waging this brutal economic war against Iran. Perhaps you can help enlighten us on the degrees in comparison between the crippling sanctions of the Obama years preceding the nuclear deal versus how it is now. But it seems like the U.S. is really pushing Iran up against the wall right now.
Yeah, no, it is worse now because the amount of oil, for instance, that the Iranians can sell is less than what they could before. But it's also a psychological factor. You know, back then, people really didn't have much expectation or hope. But because of the nuclear deal, expectations and hope really started to rise. So they had an expectation of being in a good place now. Instead, they're in a place that is worse than what it was before the nuclear deal was struck. So that is a big psychological blow to the population.
Yeah. And so, in fact, just talk about that part of it, because that's the most important part of it that always gets subsumed. Just like with all history, all we ever learn about is presidents and wars. But what about the people who are caught in the middle here? What do crippling sanctions mean for the people of Persia?
It means that they have a tremendous amount of difficulty making ends meet. It means that their hope of being able to have a future in which the United States and Iran actually would be able to be on at least decent terms is more or less crushed now, but it's not because of what the regime did, it's because of what the U.S. did. And this is important because you have an entire generation now. They were not there when Mossadegh was overthrown. They were not there when the revolution happened. They were not there during the Iraq-Iran war. Their first formative experience with the United States is the United States reneging on a deal that it had signed.
You know, there was this great piece, I don't know if you saw it, in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. It's kind of a side point, but it's so important about the media coverage of just that. Well, America withdrew from the deal. But the idea that the Iranians might enrich some uranium up to 20%, still far short of weapons grade, in order to make a statement, which is actually allowed in the deal if part of the other side reneges on the thing, which they admitted in Haaretz. But they say, oh, that would be Iran breaking the deal, sabotaging the deal, and exactly. Violating its terms and all of these things in the worst way, where America just, forgot about it, walked away from whatever, however they phrase it, to always give it a euphemism and make it sound like it's perfectly legit for Donald Trump to break this perfectly good deal for no good reason and pick this fight. But for them to respond in any way, we get to sit here and say, how dare you break the deal that we already left?
Exactly. No, irony has become an obsolete word at this point.
Seriously. Hang on just one second for me. Hey guys, you probably need a new website. A lot of people do. what you need to do then is go to expanddesigns.com. The great Harley Abbott and his team over at expanddesigns.com, they'll hook you up with a great new website for 2019. And in fact, what you really should do is type in expanddesigns.com/Scott, and you'll save $500. All right, so now we almost had a war last Thursday, it seems like, and people are disputing exactly how close we were to airstrikes. But you know what? Before that New York Times story hit, I had a tip that, hey, we're about to attack Iran. They're going to hit the radar station, some SAMs, and things like this. And then I believe that the Tucker Carlson show with featuring Colonel Douglas McGregor actually stopped the war on Thursday night. It's a correlation without exact proof of causation, but it sure seems like a probable explanation. I wasn't the only one who thought so. But that's how close it got.
I can tell you, I can't go into the details, but I can tell you that from what I saw as this whole thing was played out, and I got phone calls from contacts in Congress telling me this is about to happen, and then I was in touch with some of the folks that you mentioned. What has been reported is very much jiving with what I saw happening.
Yeah, that they really were about to attack, and Trump called it off at the last second, you mean?
Because of Tucker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of Tucker, yeah. And you know what? So let's talk about that a little bit, because here's what's special about Tucker. He was a hawk on Iraq, but he clearly regretted it and learned his lesson. He's one of the only people on that level of TV media who, you know, has had a sincere change of heart on it. And you can tell what's the key to it. And this comes up when he talks with McGregor all the time. The key to it is he understands the difference between Sunni and Shia. So the Israel lobby and all of the hawks say, oh, radical Islam. And Tucker goes, well, gee whiz, Colonel McGregor, isn't it the case that Iran hates al-Qaeda and ISIS? And they're the ones who are actually the enemies of the American people in any way, whereas Iran and their allies haven't really done anything to us. And McGregor says, that's right, Tucker. And that's the conversation that never happens with any other host or any other guest in any other place. We have this massive sectarian war led, of course, by, not that they're fighting over religion, but it's, you know, Riyadh versus Tehran over there. And who's on whose side? And Tucker is interested enough to know the difference at all. And that's enough to make the difference on whether he's going to support war against Iran and their allies, essentially.
And I think that's definitely a big part of it. But I also think that it's because of the fact of seeing how war has totally devastated the United States itself, and that the values of freedoms, liberty, etc., is being infringed upon the more the United States turns into an empire, the more it is involved militarily all over the world. All of those national security concerns do not stop at the border. They come into the United States and suddenly we have a police state. I'm not saying that's where we are right now, but I think those are also very valid concerns that people like Tucker and others on the conservative side have. And also a sense that, you know, at the end of the day, it's not that Tucker, I think, would like to be on the Iranian side of this. I think he says, I don't understand why the United States should be involved in this at all. We don't have a dog in this fight.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's saying we should ally with Iran and the Shiites, but for God's sakes, we're here backing jihadis against them in places like Syria and Yemen, and I know that ain't right. I don't care how much you hate the Ayatollah. You can't hate him more than Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher of New York City. You know, it would seem like that's not even my opinion. That's scientific fact or something. If you're an American and you have to choose between those two, who do you hate more? Not who do you want to support, but just who do you oppose more? It's kind of a black and white sort of an issue when you put it that way, isn't it? But not if you work for the CIA or the Obama administration or the Trump administration, for that matter. See our current Yemen policy. Anyway, so let's talk about the Iranian side of this. You and Elijah Magnier and Bernard over at Moon of Alabama and some others who I really respect and I know are all very biased against violent conflict here are saying that, you know what, it may well have been the Iranians who bombed one or two or more of the ships here in the last 6 weeks. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that it's very plausible that it could have been them. I think there's some important question marks as to how, how it would make sense for them to do this against the Japanese tanker at a moment when the Japanese prime minister is in Iran, first time in 40 years, meeting with the supreme leader. So there's question marks about it, but I think the more important point is some more solid evidence needs to be put forward, mindful of the fact that John Bolton has a very long history as a serial fabricator of intelligence in order to get war. This is not an administration with credibility. This is not a national security advisor that has any credibility. And you also have several countries in the region who would love to get the United States and Iran into war with each other. So we have to have our guards up. That doesn't mean that Iran is exonerated. It could very well have been them, but we need to have a high standard of evidence here in order to avoid getting tricked into a war.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, that's the obvious point everyone should be considering is who all might have done it, who have an incentive to do something like that on all the different sides here. And I guess what Elijah Magnier is saying is that this wasn't a false flag to start a war. This was a signal by the Iranians that you better not start a war because look how much we can cost you for pennies on the dollar. And we are masters of this asymmetric game, and this is just step 0.1. And we can, take out these ships, cripple these ships, do it in a deniable way, not really kill anybody. They could have killed some people, but they didn't. But do it in a way where it's not enough to start a war, but it's enough to show that they're ready for war if it really comes to it, as a warning to Trump. What do you think about that?
I think it is a plausible explanation of what could have happened. At the same time, I think there are other explanations that could shine some light on the situation. One of them being that so far, the strategy of maximum pressure has been extremely costly to Iran, but it has had essentially no cost to the United States.
Yeah.
And it's not until the Iranians start to counter-escalate that you actually see some form of a cost being inflicted on Trump, and particularly if this is then dragged to the point in which Trump has to make a decision as to whether he actually wants to go to war or not. At that point, not only is it a very costly scenario for the United States, but also it maximizes the tensions between Trump and Bolton and could potentially lead to Bolton's firing, which I think the Iranians would see as a necessary step in order for them to even entertain any negotiations with the Trump administration. In addition, it raises the cost for the Europeans to just sit there and talk nicely about the JCPOA, but do absolutely nothing concretely that could make sure that the JCPOA would survive. Mm-hmm. So there's several different explanations that could explain why the Iranians would want to do this. But as I point out in my piece in NBC, they could achieve almost all of these things by just simply starting to escalate some of their nuclear activities. They would not have to go and do an attack on a tanker, because that carries a lot of other types of risk and a significant downside compared to what they would be doing on the nuclear side. So again, there's good explanation as to why they did, the good explanation as to why they may not have been them, and also why it may have been some others, particularly those who actually have a very clear interest in dragging the United States into another war.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, you mentioned the EU there. What is the status of the so-called special purpose vehicle loophole for continuing trade between Iran and Europe? Is that all fallen through?
It's not entirely operational at this point, but the bigger problem is that if the Europeans are only going to be engaging in trade that Trump hasn't yet sanctioned, then it's actually quite meaningless, because what really actually would be of importance is for them to continue to buy Iranian oil as they were prior to these sanctions. That's what makes a difference. The Iranians are in a bizarre situation right now in which they are under more sanctions now when they're abiding by a nuclear agreement than they were back a couple of years ago when they were accused of having violated one.
Yeah. Well, and I know for you and for me and listeners to this show who know better, it's the most frustrating thing to see Trump say, all they have to do is renounce nuclear weapons. He said on Saturday, the U.S. would be Iran's best friend if only they would renounce nuclear weapons, Trita.
Yeah, it's that simple.
I mean, they signed the NPT in 72, right? For God's sake.
Even earlier than that. And they've been living up to the nuclear agreement. And they have honored their words, whereas, unfortunately, the United States has not.
And, this is a real important thing, too. And we talked about this back in the time when they were negotiating the nuclear treaty. But essentially, the JCPOA is superfluous. They've been members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty this whole time. And the IAEA had continued to verify the non-diversion of nuclear material to any military or other special purpose umpteen million times. That whole time since they began their nuclear project at the beginning of the century. And so really all the JCPOA was meant to do was to put unjustified fears at bay, to allay those, to say, listen, if you think that NPT isn't good enough, try this and a whole other layer. And really, when you look at the deal, what is it? It's all this stuff essentially to get them to adopt an additional protocol to their safeguards agreement and a couple of subsidiary arrangements, which could have been negotiated just as one-offs, as no big deals all along. In fact, they were abiding by the additional protocol while they were negotiating with the Europeans in the Bush years there for a long time. And so this whole thing, even if they left the JCPOA, that wouldn't mean that they left the NPT and started making nukes,
Yeah, but there's a big difference, though, because as a result of the JCPOA, the United States, for the first time, comes in and essentially accepts that Iran will continue to have enrichment on its soil.
Right.
Now, of course, the U.S. position of denying Iran that was never really grounded in any proper international law. But through the JCPOA, the United States gave up on that position. Now, of course, with Trump, it seems like it may have returned to that position. And that is in and of itself a highly problematic thing, mindful of the fact that few countries are going to be trusting the United States if one administration does not honor the signature of the previous administration.
Yeah, well, we see all the time. I mean, the case of Bush finally allowing Gaddafi to come back in from the cold only to have Barack Obama stab him in the back has got to be the biggest lesson in the world for any country, that has the Americans coming after him. And John Bolton tried to ruin the North Korea deal by saying, yeah, we're looking at doing on things on the Libya model there. I mean, come on. As though Kim couldn't have thought of that himself. He needs to be reminded by Bolton that, go ahead and make yourself helpless and see what happens. So what do we do now?
Well, I think at this point, frankly, unless Trump fires Bolton, I think we're going to continue to be in this scenario in which every week or so there will be a crisis. I think the only way out, frankly, for Trump right now is to get a different team, a team that agrees with what he at least is saying is his position, which is that he wants to have negotiations. He is surrounded right now by people who want war, people who have never pursued diplomacy with Iran, never supported diplomacy with Iran, never even spoken to an Iranian diplomat. So the idea that this team would be able to come up with a diplomatic strategy is quite laughable. So if Trump truly wants to have those negotiations, then, what he needs to do is to surround him with people that will enable him to actually actualize that objective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the prime minister of Japan went there to say, hey, Trump wants to talk with you. And the Ayatollah told Abe, forget it. There's no point in talking to this guy. Why would I try to make a deal with a guy like this who, never mind one president betraying the last president's obligations, but you can't trust this guy from sunup to sundown. So, he would have to see some real incentives, it seems like, to want to negotiate with Trump, who has, acted as though he is willing to go to war over essentially nothing.
One of the things that I thought was interesting with what Khamenei was saying, that he wasn't entirely ruling out negotiations, but he was ruling it out under the circumstances that currently exist, with Trump being surrounded with that team, it pursuing, maximum pressure and sanctions. But he hasn't entirely closed the door. I don't know if Trump picked up on that in any way, shape, or form, but so far he hasn't acted as if he has.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much, Trita Parsi, everybody, founder of NIAC. That's National Iranian American Council, teacher at Georgetown, and author of Losing an Enemy. Thanks, Trita. All right, y'all. Thanks. Find me at libertarianinstitute.org, at scotthorton.org, antiwar.com, and reddit.com/Scott Horton Show. Oh, yeah, and read my book, Fool's Errand, Time to end the war in Afghanistan at foolserrand.us.